Hello, I'm going to be talking about the Russian Gulag, and that came about because of some work I was having done in my house. As some of you know, I iron stuff, and I have a steam press. I find that really handy, and as I said, I iron sheets, and I use the steam press. It doesn't take that much time then. But the steam press is on the worktop by the side of my kitchen. And underneath the worktop is a little under-counter freezer and my washing machine. And when now that steam press takes up quite a bit of the worktop. So when I have ironed stuff, I have nowhere to put the clothes I've ironed. And I thought, well, what I need to do is I need to put a shelf underneath the worktop between the washing machine and the bottom of the worktop, so I can pull it out and then I can put the ironed stuff on the pull-out shelf and then push it back underneath when I've finished. Well, as it turns out, the only place to put it was not over the washing machine, but over the freezer. Now, freezers belt out a lot of heat, so I needed wood that wouldn't warp. And I reckoned that probably something like birch ply. Birch is a sort of hardwood. Ply is, a laminated wood, and you don't really need that much thickness. And you've got your shelf, and it's not going, providing it's properly, oiled or whatever, it's not going to warp. Right, so that's the setup. So I found a joiner who could do that, who could stick it on these runners so it'll pull out. And I spoke to him about 2 months ago, maybe even a bit more. And he said, oh yeah, no problem. I could easily cut you a piece of wood and put it on the runners and it'll be fine. Lovely. Didn't hear from him for weeks. And I kept sending him texts saying, well, let's make up a name for him. Peter. I say, Peter, why? What's happening with the shelf? And he said, haven't got the wood yet. I started actually to think that he was just fobbing me off because it just went on and on and on. Anyway, finally he turned up with some wood in his van, and he brought it round. He said, here's birch ply, very good stuff, this will do the job. And I said, why did it take so long? He said, you can't get it anymore. And I said, why? He said, it comes from Russia. So it turns out this is what happens. Russia cuts the wood. Russia has huge reserves of wood, of trees rather. It lumbers the wood and then exports it to Finland, places, I think Finland and Lithuania, I think he said. And there it's turned into, it's sliced up and turned into various wood products, including ply. And then that's shipped from these countries to Britain. So it's not just oil and gas we're talking about here, it's wood, which it did occur to me that, Russia does have a lot of resources. It's such a pity the waste, the way it's wasted those resources, but it has a lot, and it's got the oil and it's got the wheat. If it had taken Ukraine, it would have had more oil and wheat. It would have been able to blackmail the rest of the world for years. That just occurred to me when I was thinking of we knew about that before, but it didn't occur to me that if Russia got all of this, it would have been able to blackmail everybody. So here we have this situation where birch ply is more difficult to get hold of now. And I got hold of, Peter got hold of half a sheet from somewhere. And it's, sort of 3 times the price or whatever. Well, obviously there are other places where you can get birch ply from, but Russia was the go-to place. Anyway, this whole situation reminded me of the Labour Party and the Russian expulsions, deportations and exiles to places like Siberia, where the people who were deported were working in these lumber areas. They were actually supplying wood to Britain at the time. They were supplying it to other places as well. So what happened was this. In the 20s, the British Labour Party was getting its first taste of power, and they were full of socialist idealism. At least that's the way they like to put it. And this is an article from the Institute of Economic Affairs, and it says, when was the date of guilty knowledge for defenders of Soviet communism? At what point did Western supporters of the regime cease to be merely naive and became knowingly complicit? Commenting on the pyramid of corpses that the Bolsheviks had built, George Orwell remarked in 1941 that all people who are morally sound have known since about 1931 that the Russian regime stinks. Now, in 1930, the New Statesman reported, and the New Statesman is a socialist paper, that de-kulakization, the kulaks were called the wealthy peasants, and by wealthy we're talking about, maybe they owned a cow, it was that made them wealthy, was a cruel experiment involving imprisonment and execution. Over the next 2 years, 1.8 million kulaks were arrested and deported north. 240,000 of them died. And many of those were children, because it wasn't just the father of the family or the loud-mouthed uncle. It was entire families loaded into trains and dumped in snowy forests. Over the next, by 1931, 60,000 Russians had been arrested on religious grounds, so this isn't just the kulaks, and 5,000 shot. The exact numbers may not have been known in the West, but the basic facts of Soviet mass murder, disenfranchisement and slave labour were available to any literate Briton by the end of the 1920s. Now, in 1930, they took part, there was a huge pray-in for the persecuted. So they were doing a lot of praying for the Christians who were persecuted. And it says here, not everybody, the Soviets' use of unpaid prison labour to produce timber in the unbearable conditions of northern Russia was well documented and led many countries to boycott Russian timber in the 1920s. British sailors travelling to northern Russia, this was because they were there on British boats to pick up the timber, and they saw what was happening. I think somebody told me, and this is not the timber thing, but they said during the northern, what was it called? The Arctic Fleet, the British and American ships that went by the northern route to northern Russia to bring weapons and food during World War II. Somebody said I think it was his grandfather, he was on one of those boats and he saw a woman who had just put a handful of grain into her pocket to, no doubt, to take back to her family, and she was shot. So this is British sailors were, again, they were in Russia to pick up timber, and they saw what was going on. They saw the conditions of the prisoners who were loading the timber onto the boats, and they also managed to get give shelter to some stowaways who told their stories. So everybody had the evidence. Timber made in the gulags was illegal under the Foreign Prison-Made Goods Act of 1897. So already in Britain they had a law that had to do with not using slave labour for not allowing imported goods. that depend on slave labour. And the Labour Party, of course, you know, up the workers, had taken a strong stand against sweated goods, both from foreign countries and in this country, when they were in opposition. That was in the mid-1920s. And yet the Labour Party did not ban anything from Russia once they were in power. The Conservatives, the nasty old Conservatives, did that in 1933. And many on the British left absolutely refused to see what was going on. The evidence was there, but it was all disinformation, this problem. So desperate to believe in the success of what Labour leader George Lansbury called the wonderful experiment, large numbers of British socialists were suckers for Soviet propaganda. After one stage-managed visit to the USSR, George Strauss MP declared that conditions for prisoners in the gulags were very much more favourable than in our English prisons. Yeah, I remember that. Ben Tillett MP described Russian prisons as being more like a hospital than a place of detention. There's one, I don't have it to hand, but I remember reading an article by somebody else. He went to one of the prison camps. This was long after they'd been closed. He took a tour around what was left of one of them, and he saw the punishment cells. These punishment cells were unheated outhouses out in the, outside. So you went into one of those and a very good chance you'd just freeze to death overnight. But he said apparently the door, the inside of the door of these cells was made of metal that had been scored like a cheese grater. So that if a prisoner tried banging on the door or went mad and started banging on the door, they would lacerate their hands. He said he couldn't believe the cruelty of those places. And we get these British politicians saying, oh, they're more like holiday camps. Or another sympathetic observer concluded that prisoners' living standards were as good as those of first-class misdemeanants in England. His only complaint was that the Muscovite inmates could only get bourgeois foreign newspapers rather than the good international labour ones. The Soviet regime agreed to rectify the situation. Okay. And some people realised it wasn't quite the thing, but nevertheless, that old thing about omelettes can't be made without breaking eggs. Freedom is, in reality, rigidly subordinated to the state purpose, admitted The Guardian in 1931, talking about Russia, before adding, so long as the people submit to be disciplined and regimented in the name of socialism or any other name, it is not for us to interfere, only to watch this amazing triumph of human endurance. Now, I just want to point something out. Russia is a poor country. It's poor and it's badly managed. That's obvious. A well-managed country could have walked over Ukraine in 5 minutes. They couldn't do it. It's brutal. It's brutal to the people it conquers, and it's brutal to its own people. And it is underpopulated. Now look, we've got like several million people who were killed in the 30s, who were taken out of the breeding pool in the 30s, the 40s and the 50s. There's a whole lot of population that just didn't breed in Russia. And because of that, that's why they're underpopulated. And then after that, with collectivization and state flats, the tiny state flats and rationing and all the rest of it, the Russians just didn't produce even the so-called free ones, the townies, the ones who had the political blessing. They didn't produce that many children. And so the Russian population is in demographic decline. Quite a steep demographic decline, I have been given to understand. So Russia could have been a populous, powerful country now. I know weather conditions aren't that good in Russia, but they're not that good in Sweden and Norway either, and they have covered walkways and a lot of underground stuff, and Russia could have done that too. But they exiled all their imaginative people and they killed all the workers, or the ones who had a little more oomph about them, like the kulaks, for instance. They're just peasants who worked that bit harder, who knew a bit more about animal husbandry and who had therefore built a slightly more comfortable life for themselves. They're all dead. And their children. They didn't just kill some of the older generation, they actually took the children as well. And of course, they didn't survive in the Siberian forests, even less than the adults did. So that's what Russia has done to itself. It's been doing it for 100 years. And these are the people, people are trying to say we should accommodate them. No, they have a deep psychological problem in Russia. And if they are allowed to prevail, then they will not stop doing what they're doing. The problem with Russia has been that nobody has been able to actually defeat them. I'm not sure how we defeat them now. I'm not saying go to war or anything like that. We aren't those sorts of people anymore. But we do have to think that these are people who have been brutalised by history, by their weather, by the Mongols, whatever. There are many reasons for their problems, but still, just because somebody is a criminal because of a bad background doesn't mean to say you've got to let them carry on being criminals. All right, well, and also the Labour Party. This is conveniently forgotten, how the socialists ignore these horrible cruelties when it's socialism that's involved. And even the newspapers don't give them the coverage they deserve for their crimes. And we all have to remember that. All right, well, that's it. I'm Graniopteryx. I'm to be found on YouTube, Rumble, BitChute and Minds. Especially YouTube's quite bad at notifying you of new videos, so subscribe to Twitter, Gab or Parler, where I am at Graniopteryx, and you'll get a notification direct from me. All right, that's it. Oh, by the way, let it never be said I don't have a husband who brings me presents. He took the dog for a walk this morning and he came back with some flowers for me, which he put in a little vase, so they'd be well watered, and he brought them to me. This is it. What can you say? The man's daft as a brush. All right. Till next time. Why not treat yourself or a favoured relative or friend to these magnificent examples of merch? The mugs and t-shirts come in the Graniopteryx design or Granbo with a firearm or the more deadly knitting needles. Go to www.graniopteryx.com and whatever platform you're watching this on, please click like, subscribe and share.